Hello, this is the 5th day of the May for Makers Challenge, and today we'll be talking about quick tips. If you are anything like me as a maker, you tend to not plan ahead or at least do your research before a project or attempting to learn a skill, and that is perfectly fine. It's incredibly fun, and even though sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating because you seem to have hit a dead end with no really way out of it except to start over, it can be extremely educational. There are other makers who plan, such as my good friend Kit from Skilltree, who tend to plan a lot before attempting a project, and they sort of seem to have it really nailed down on the first try, although your mileage may vary. Either way, whichever kind of maker you are, quick tips are very important and very helpful, even if you're someone like me who listens to no one but his own advice. In the past May for Maker episodes, I have described and given a tour around my workspace, my workshop, and the first quick tip is just that. A lot of people seem to comment on Discord, at least, that I have an orderly and an organized space. I disagree. I would like it to be a little bit more organized, but most of the time I can't kid anyone but myself. This is just a mess. It's more chaotic than Pandora's box. So basically, my first point would be to try and keep everything in its own place. It's fine to have a cluttered desk, it's fine to have a cluttered workspace. You're not any worse of a maker if you have something like that. It's perfectly fine, as long as everything is where you need it. And it's really just a matter of working with efficiency in mind, if that is your goal at the end of the day. Finding the right tools when you need them is extremely helpful. It can lead to a lot less frustration while working for a project, and it will result into a lot less time wasted when you're trying to get something done within a limited time frame. So try to keep your space organized and orderly. It will help you a lot. The second tip, which I would like to share with you, is lighting. Lighting is extremely important. Now, I was a person who used to discount how much light is important when working on a project, especially when working in minute details. Granted, I don't usually work in such small scales. I usually work in larger projects, or at least medium-sized projects. So a regular neon tube in the garage is enough. Sometimes I just open the door and the sunlight in the morning is fine. But at other times when I need to work in some detail, I tend to use my workspace, for my workbench, for the very simple reason that when I put the table on it for storage, I also have tubes underneath which I can turn on. They give an insane amount of bright light. In fact, so much so that I find it a little bit uncomfortable to record on camera because it doesn't show properly. But in terms of working, it's very helpful to have something like this, and I can really appreciate its use. You can also have kind of LEDs, LED lamps with goosenecks or something like that, which you can sort of direct around. I also have another LED spotlight, which I usually stick to the rafter. It's got a metal bar and this is magnetic, so I stick it on top, especially when I need a certain light on a project. So yes, lighting is very important in the workshop. Make sure that you are adequately lit. It's also very good for your eyes. It's easier for the eyes and you strain less. Some tips on leatherworking. When tooling leather or carving leather, it's very important to have an evenly saturated surface. This means that when you are soaking your leather in water, it doesn't need to be soaked dry, so it doesn't need to be drenched in water unless you are doing something like wet molding, in which case that's a separate technique. But I'm talking about carving and stamping using, the swivel knife and using a set of stamps or bevelers, that sort of thing. It is very important to have your surface evenly saturated with water. Usually this is done by applying it with a damp sponge. You can see the leather usually changes color from this sort of lightish, sort of tan kind of color, lightish brown color, and when it's wet it tends to go to a deeper brown soaking, saturated color. So it's very important to know exactly where your leather is standing before starting to carve. It is also good to keep in mind that as you are carving and tooling and working on your leather, it tends to dry up. If you live in a place which is very similar to Malta, Malta is very humid and very warm. However, despite it being humid, the leather dries up very quickly. So even when I am carving, I usually every few minutes I have to soak the leather again, just saturate it with a sponge. The more I do this, the more water is absorbed in the leather and the longer it takes for it to dry again. But it's very important to keep an eye on that, because if the leather is not dry, it will tool nicely. the lines will be even, they will be clean. If it is dry, however, it is more likely to grip on the blade and grip on the swivel knife and not tool properly. If you're trying to stamp leather and it's dry, it usually tends to darken the recesses wherever it is pressured. So keep that in mind. If you're going for that sort of look, you can of course go ahead and use that to your advantage, but otherwise if you're going for a nicer, clean, even color of the for the leather, and then you're perhaps going to antique it leather, I would suggest that you saturate it with water adequately. The second tip for leather working involves stitching. Stitching is one of my banes. I do not hate stitching per se, but it's such a long and tedious process. Stitching starts by punching holes into the leather, of course. I use a diamond punch because I do not have chisel punches. Chisel punches are usually neater. I still need to get myself a set. But one thing which is universal with all kind of piercing tools and prongs and you know, these kinds of punches that you would use in leather, even lacing punches, they tend to get stuck in the leather, which is very tedious to remove, and sometimes that can end up even marring your leather a little bit. So if you have a punch which is stuck in the leather and you tend to go pull it, it tends to warp the leather slightly, especially if it is a little bit too wet. Now, one way you can do this is by pushing the punches into a block of beeswax. Beeswax will act as a lubricant, it will stop it from sticking to the leather, and it will make your life so much easier. One final quick tip that I would like to share with you is this, and it doesn't just apply to making, it applies to a lot of different kinds of things in life. Trust yourself. In making in particular, if you are not certain about something, try it out anyway. Maybe not try it on the actual piece that you're working on, maybe find another scrap piece which you would like to try on. If it's a new design, if it is a new kind of carving, try to use it on a scrap piece of leather or a scrap piece of wood and try it out that way. But I have found more often than not that when I went off script and when I went deviating from the plan, I usually ended up with results which are rather unique, a lot more satisfying, and basically resulted in something which was far superior than what I originally had planned. That being said, your mileage may vary. My word is definitely not gospel, but this is just my experience in the shop. So yeah, trust yourself, always within safety parameter, of course. Always keep safe when in your workshop, whether you're tooling leather, whether you're cutting wood or anything else. Make sure that you do so with at least a little bit of rationality. I will see you next time, and as always, stay safe and keep making.